to Decoding Sales, a podcast where an engineer, that's me, Alex, and a salesperson
That's me, Peter.
talk about the art and science of sales as it relates to life and business. In this episode, we are doing something a little bit special. If you are listening in your normal podcasting app, you should know that we are recording our first ever video episode. This is an experiment for us to see how it goes. This might not be the last one, but we don't know. We'll find out. We'll have it on YouTube. We'll put a link in the show notes. So that if you do want to watch us, you're welcome to, or continue to listen to your normal podcast episode. If you're watching us on video, we just want to say hi. Thank you for joining us. And in this episode, we are going to talk about the art of subtle cues in human communication. So important in any sales process. The deal could hinge on and be won or lost on just noticing the subtle expression, the little frown that tells you something's not quite right. And that's really hard in a virtual environment to pick up on. So in this episode, we're going to talk about subtle cues, both in the real world and then how that translates into a virtual environment. How can you pick up on the right subtle cues? How do you respond when you've picked up a negative cue? And how do you build momentum and energy when you have a positive cue? And finally, what exactly are these cues? What should you be looking for? How do they translate from one environment to the next? Before we begin, I want to give a special shout out to our sponsor, salesroom.com. Salesroom is an innovative product built to help sellers break through with a number of really powerful features to make a customized, personalized sales experience for the buyer and the seller. Peter's been a beta user, and I think he has lots of nice things to say about them. Peter, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, I love the concept of sales room. There's so many things that you could do within virtual selling that Zoom simply can't handle. One of my favorite features personally is having the timeline of how long you have left in the meeting and also which topics are coming up in the milestone or the agenda that you set. And so you actually see like a really clean view of the agenda virtually within the video frame itself, which helps sellers, I think, track the meeting in an efficient way and effective way.
So please go to salesroom.com and check them out because Salesroom is the only video conferencing solution built from the ground up to help salespeople break through. Okay, Peter, let's dive into the content of this episode. Let's start off in the non-virtual world for a minute and talk a bit about these subtle cues. When you were a young sales person at Dropbox making big enterprise deals, what were some of the key things that you would be looking for in those one-on-one or small group or even big group conversations to tell you whether or not the deal was on track, that weren't what they were saying, but what they were doing?
Yeah, I think one of the things about body language is, when you're actually in a room, there's often a presentation, that's being shown on the board. And so I actually used to see, okay, how many times are folks looking at the
Mm,
presentation versus turning to look at you and engaging with you?
mm,
And usually, in physical meetings, I should say, it's not typically one-on-one in an enterprise sales setting. There's usually 8 people in the room, maybe 2 or 3 people from the selling side and 4 or 5 people on the customer side. So I think body language is not just obviously like how they look, if they're slumped over, if they have good posture, because that's very variable. But I think
mm,
it's also like how much they move around in their seat, right?
mm,
And oftentimes if people are just looking at the presentation, I often see that as a negative
mm,
because there's no variability in them engaging with you from like the in-person room perspective,
mm.
right? So that's just one example of body language cues where you're really understanding how engaging you are based off of how much they're focused on you versus like the actual static presentation that might be on the board.
So you're kind of saying like if they're just locked in on that presentation, they're only receiving information kind of through that one intellectual channel, but not sort of the maybe more emotional or human-centered channel of connecting with you. And that's
Yeah,
probably not a great sign for the deal if it's
yeah,
at that
exactly. And
level.
yeah, also like, even in a one-on-one conversation, I'd say like a lot of people who are engaged will change their posture and their body and their positioning multiple times. And, in dramatic moments, you might lean in. And in very boring moments, you might lean back and just seem very reticent, right? Yeah, and so you're even doing that in a virtual capacity, so I can sense like the difference in engagement. And I think that's big in an in-person meeting. And those are cues that you used to pick up on that again are harder in a virtual setting. So you need to actually um on purpose intentionally create space for that.
I really want to dive into the theme in a minute. But before we get there, I am quite curious if you have any tactics that you like to use. It's very easy when somebody brings up an objection explicitly to kind of identify that and talk about that. But if if somebody is just kind of disengaged, uh, or if they seem very excited, vice versa, I'm curious how some of the techniques you've used to really address those subtle cues in a natural way rather than beating somebody over the head. Like you look like you're maybe a little disengaged right now.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So actually, it's not too far off from what you just said right now. But of course, I don't say you look disengaged. But if I do feel like somebody's skeptical, I will say you actually look a little bit skeptical about
Mm,
what I'm saying. I'll stop myself because I personally get very nervous if somebody looks disengaged or somebody looks not happy or disappointed or doesn't really buy into a grandiose vision statement I just put out there. I don't like to keep going.
mm,
I just kinda call out the elephant in the room and say, "That's what I believe, but you seem a little skeptical. Do you agree with what I just mentioned?"
mm.
And give that person space to address what you're sensing. And
Mm,
often sometimes folks actually say, "No, I'm not skeptical at all. I'm just there's a lot going through my mind right now." That's
mm,
happened to me. And I actually completely agree with you. I'm just trying to digest
mm,
everything because this is the first time this concept has come through my head, which can be a positive, right? If you're telling them something that's actually, very exciting and unique. On the other hand, it
mm.
gives them the space to say, yeah, actually, I don't agree with you, and you've read my body language correctly. So even if you're incorrect about some of the assumptions around body language, I think it's important to just take a step back and call out what you think is going on.
Can I try some analogy here? It's
Yeah,
almost
yeah,
like
of
you're
course.
using the body language as like an alignment check during the meeting. Are we in the same headspace? Are we in the same place? And as long as you're kind of in the same place, you know that everybody's engaged. You're having the conversation you want to be having. But if the body language is different and you're seeing sort of a misalignment of some kind, your goal as a salesperson is to address that as quickly as possible so you don't diverge too far and lose trust, lose the credibility, but instead the threads start to diverge and then you like bring them back together or
Exactly.
understand exactly where the gap is so that you can either address it and maybe strip line, as we talked about many times, or cut the deal and say this isn't the right fit. Do you ever do that? By the way, you kind of say like you look skeptical or I sense some concerns, and then they give some concerns, and you're like, this is definitely not the right deal. I should get off this call.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Get off the call, and also in a meeting, there's still you can still strip line an in-person meeting. Obviously, an in-person meeting is much more expensive in terms of traveling to the meeting and being there and having, the physical time to spend with somebody. But you can say things like, it seems like we might not be fully aligned, so
Mm,
that's okay. But let me explain to you like a few more things just to make sure that this might not be a fit, right? Or just to
mm,
make sure there's something I'm not missing, or just to make sure there's something that you might not be interested in that I'm not like hitting on right now, right?
mm,
But yeah, it's very common for me to say, hey, if those are your concerns and you don't agree with my statements and you don't agree with my view of the world, it just might not be a good fit, and that's totally fine.
mm.
Yeah,
I
but
love
it,
it.
it gives it gives I like what you said about like if the threads diverge, it stopping and calling out something like body language or skepticism allows you to bring them back together. It allows you to course correct during the
Mhm,
meeting, right? And I think that's really, really important in sales because if you
mm.
don't course correct, you lose your audience and you lose credibility.
One thing that I think is always really interesting for maybe the founder listeners of the podcast is baselining where they're kind of at or their expectations against the typical. So I'm actually quite curious. How often do you find that you need to course correct? Is it once in a call? Is it multiple times a call? Once a week? How often does this actually happen?
For something that's new, like a new platform or new concept, which, we've mentioned Twingate multiple times. Founders on this call, you're probably selling something that's unique and novel and that doesn't quite yet exist in the world, or maybe is 5 or 6 years ahead of its time. And in those situations, you're constantly course correcting. I'm constantly course
Mm,
correcting and I'm constantly checking in on whether or not I'm hitting the right temperature
mm,
and the right notes. And so I'm constantly using phrases like, am I on the right track? Do you agree that these are problems? Does it make
mm,
sense the approach we're taking? Now I know this is very different, so I want to pause just to make sure like I'm addressing any of the concerns you might have or any questions you might have.
mm.
This is a very different take on zero trust networking, or this is a very different take on this problem space, which is why I'm excited about this. But I just want to make sure that you also buy into the statements I'm making.
This sounds really exhausting. You
Yeah,
know,
it,
you're
it is.
you're
e- Yeah, it is exhausting, but it's also extremely liberating, and it's actually very empowering. I'll say because you're constantly drawing the other party into the conversation and having them
mm,
think too. And
mm,
it's very exhausting, but selling is exhausting. And so I want an active participant on the other end.
mm,
And so I use a lot of like speaking of subtle cues, I try and like call them out all the time
mm,
because they're opportunities for me to make sure the other side is engaged.
mhm. I really like this. I think this applies. We talk about all the time about in the podcast. It's not just about business, but also life. I think this applies so much in any relationship or any interaction with another person. Trying to find where the energy is converging in the conversation. If it's diverging, trying to change course or bring up another topic where there might be an alignment, and kind of I feel like you're in a party and you're talking to somebody and maybe it's kind of weird and you're like the energy's not there and then you try something else to change the tone. It feels like it's a very similar kind of skill here, except so much more refined. I bet you'd be great at parties. I mean,
Maybe
I,
I
I
don't
know you
know.
are from from Dropbox days. I am quite
it's
confident
it,
in that.
It is very exhausting. Yeah, and the concept of strip lining that you mentioned earlier, yeah, is very relevant in social settings too, right? Like you have to know when to cut bait, when to cut
Hmm.
it loose. And yeah, there's things we do socially to say, "Oh, it actually looks like you're busy," or, "Hey, I'm gonna grab a drink actually,"
Hmm.
or "I'll talk to you in a little bit. I actually have to like talk to my friend over here." There's all sorts of eject buttons that we have, and it's the same
Hmm.
thing in sales. Like in fact, in virtual sales, if somebody looks like they're on a different screen or they're typing, I'll sometimes say like, "Hey, I'm sure you're really busy. It looks like you're really busy, so I'll try to give you 10 minutes back at the end of this call." Right? And that there's a subtle cue in there where when I see somebody on a Slack message, I can just tell, or like when somebody's responding to somebody, they'll be like, just 1 second, please. Sometimes there's that weird 30-second pause at the beginning when you get on a call and you're like,
Hmm.
"Hey, Alex, how are you doing?" And then you're like, "I'm doing well. Sorry, just 1 second. I'm finishing up something." That is a
Hmm.
perfect subtle cue. Like that person is telling you, "I'm really busy and I barely got on this call." So
Hmm.
then you have to, instead of just going and bulldozing through that call and pitching your product, you have to say, "Well, I'm sure you're very busy. You're head of security. I'm sure you're dealing with a lot of fires. This should only take 20 minutes really, and we can even keep it to 15. And I'll let you go about your day."
hmm. Well, on that note, I have such a great example, by the way, of leveraging that subtle cue. I think we should shift a little bit to the virtual world because it is harder to pick up on some of these subtle cues. We talked earlier about you can sort of see somebody disengaging or somebody's really interested, but that's that works when there's two people on the call. It's harder when there's a field of faces. So
Yeah.
I am really curious about two things. First one is what have been the most painful missing social cues? What have you really wished you could get from that in-person social interaction that you're not able to get over Zoom?
I think the one thing that you don't get is, when you're in a boardroom style meeting, you can tell the other team looking at each other,
Mm,
so you can tell how they're engaging in subtle ways. On a Zoom call, you have no idea. Or on a virtual sales call, you have no idea who's messaging who and what they're talking about in the background. Right. So that I think is like an interesting change with virtual sales because you're speaking to everybody like face on. In a meeting room, people look at each other, right? Depending on the topic. If some like topic really interests a security officer and the IT person looks at the security officer, there's actually like a physical cue that is being shown that says, hey, actually, seller, what you mentioned is probably interesting to the security officer. In an in-person meeting, there's more space to say, hey, actually, Alex, it looks like, this is something you're really interested in. It looks like you're leading into this. And you could like kind of make sure you start the side conversation from there. Right.
mm.
But in a virtual world, that's missing. Now, people are still slacking each other. What's gained on our side is that the sellers can slack each other, right? And so you
Mm,
can still pick up things even though it's not in a room. And so there is a benefit to virtual sales too, where I can slack my sales rep and say, hey, by the way, it looks like Alex, the security officer, is disengaging. I would stop talking for a second, or like, let me jump in.
mhm.
That on the seller side is a lot easier, right? Because you can't do that in a physical room to say, "Hey, Alex, you're talking too much. Let me jump in."
So you can really up-level, like, the rest of your team by using one person's ability to really detect these subtle cues and then spread it to the whole team in a way that's much more polite than when you can't coalesce. You can't coordinate with each
Exactly.
other
Yeah.
in a room. I mean, you can kinda do
Yeah.
it by looking, but, that
Yeah.
might
And I,
not look
I
so good.
yeah, and I realized you asked like what's missing, and I turned that into like what's gained as well. But
Uh-huh.
but like it's
That's a
interesting to
typical
see.
salesperson response.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I spun
We
it
have an
the other
episode
way.
on we have an episode on this.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly. So one negative could be a positive as well. But yeah, that in-person, cue has just transitioned to like more virtual back chatter and like, like Slack messaging and chat messaging.
Mhm. Well, so I wanna push on that a little bit more actually, because I think sometimes in a physical world setting, those glances that are being exchanged are partially to communicate amongst the team, but also sometimes actually to communicate with the other parties, right? Like if I'm looking at my CEO on a conversation, that's indicating very clearly that I want everyone to know that that's the person to be talking to. So, what are and that's still valuable in a virtual setting to have that same kind of cue. It's a little bit harder
Yeah.
though. I'm curious what you've seen replace that type of communication.
Yeah, yeah. So I see myself giving a lot more and this might seem obvious, but I'll give you some phrasing examples. I find myself giving a lot more verbal cues and verbal
Mm,
spotlights to people. So if my CEO is on a call, yeah, in a physical room, I can turn to him and say, hey Tony, and address him, right? Like in a virtual setting, I can't say, hey Tony, right? I have to say, Tony, I'm actually going to turn it over to you now to explain the vision that you actually set forth with our device posture policy.
mm.
Um, and so, Alex, I know you mentioned this on a previous call that was an important topic. So I'm going to now hand it over to Tony to explain a little bit more. Tony, can you speak to that? So that was like 4 or 5 sentences of
Mm,
basically like passing the baton, but
mhm,
also, like, what you noticed me doing is I provided a lot of context from before the call as well as during the call, and then that I'm actually, like, physically or, like, virtually passing the baton in a way that hopefully felt fluid, right?
mhm. It
So
seems like that's an
yeah.
upgrade in a lot of ways. It's very
Yeah, actually,
explicit and clear.
maybe. Yeah, you have to be much more, I think, smooth and eloquent. And then also, like, by the way, like bringing people into the conversation also means bringing up situations where you notice people wanting to jump in. So I've started using the phrase a lot, hey, Tony, or like, hey, Alex, where are you going to jump in there?
Mm,
And then just
mm.
stop. because, like, you notice the mute and unmute button going on and off all the time. I notice that all the time. And sometimes it's a mistake. Sometimes I unmute myself by mistake. Sometimes
Mhm.
I mute myself on purpose. When I unmute myself, I've rarely had somebody say, "Hey, Peter, like I saw you unmuted. Did you have something to say?" Which is
Mhm.
such a hugely missed opportunity. For
Mhm.
me, every time I see somebody unmute, I log that in my mind. And even if somebody's talking, after that person finished talking, I'll say, "Hey, Alex, I think you unmuted a few seconds ago. Did you have something to say?"
Yeah, and you know
And
what? That
yeah,
goes back to, like, aligning the energy because somebody has that energy to say something, and if it gets bottled up, they're not gonna be paying attention for the rest of that part of the
exactly.
conversation.
Yeah, and introverts don't like to interrupt people. So it's
You're
also a
telling me.
communication style. Yeah, yeah, exactly. So, but if you as a seller or CEO or whoever is holding a meeting, if you can pick up on those and you can have the bandwidth to like log all of those, hugely, hugely powerful. And by the way,
Mhm.
amazingly empathetic moves to show the other side that you care about them. And I love like bringing the voice of the introvert into the meeting, right? And once you could tell like the first couple times they interject or the first couple times you give them the floor, they're a little shy, right?
Mhm.
And their voice is a little soft, but the first step is to give them the stage. The second step is to acknowledge what they asked was an amazing point. And then all of a sudden the conversation becomes a lot more richer, right? But a lot of sellers miss that opportunity because not a lot of people do that, unfortunately. Like
Well,
use the
and,
power of the unmute. Yeah.
and that is a place where the virtual world is actually better than the physical world. Speaking as somebody who doesn't like to necessarily speak out, which is kind of funny that we're doing a podcast, but in the physical world, you, there's not something as convenient as unmuting to send that signal. You can raise your hand, but we're not in fifth grade anymore. You can put your fingers up or something, but then you kind of look like a doofus or like kind of a power move. Like yeah, excuse me.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
Now you have the like raise hand thing, which also like
in
a lot of people
Zoom,
don't like to. Yeah, also a lot of people
yeah,
don't like to call attention to. Right.
I
Yeah.
find that one very awkward, personally. It puts you at the top of it pins your icon, your
I do
screen,
find
right?
that awkward
Your
too.
video,
Yeah, yeah.
and I think that's a little weird.
Everybody's fixated on that emoji.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Right, right, yeah, it really stands out, and, like,
Yeah.
something a little bit more subtle, I think, flows the conversation well. It's, like, kind of asking, like, "Can I talk?" versus being like, "Excuse me, I have my megaphone."
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I also find like introverted people actually use the chat more now, where
Mhm.
they'll like put the question in the chat. And
Yeah.
then, like, as the person who's leading the conversation, you have to say, "Hey, I see Alex put a question in the chat. Alex, that's a really good question. Answer it." And then if there's a follow-up to that, just say, "Is that what you meant when you asked that question, Alex?" Right? And so I think those types of, picking up on people's communication styles is really important in a virtual world. And sometimes it's not verbal, and sometimes it's not visual, you
Mm.
know?
Yeah.
Sometimes people don't like to turn their camera on, and oftentimes you find people having to explain why they don't want to turn their camera on, right?
Mhm.
So you have to be accommodating of that, right? And
Isn't that the real power
yeah,
move? You go into the call, you keep your camera off, and you unmute, and you just stay off of mute.
yeah, yeah, it is. Yeah, I've gotten used to it though, and I just keep my camera on, and sometimes what when the other side says, "Hey, I'm going to keep my camera off because I'm sick," or whatever the excuse is, or my camera's not working, right? And probably half the time that's a lie. They just don't want to turn the camera on. You know, your job is to say, "Oh, that's totally fine. I'm going to keep my camera on unless you want me to turn it off."
Mhm.
Because it's an opportunity for me as a seller to show my emotions and like how
Mm.
I'm engaging,
Mhm.
right? And even if the other person doesn't have their camera on, I can still, emit and convey, emotion and excitement and all that.
Yeah. It's kind of funny that we're talking about this as, folks who are doing our first ever video podcast.
I know. I know, right? We should do this more, right? Because people maybe can tell how excited we are that we're
Wait
talking
until
about
we get to
this.
the editing phase.
I
Then we're
know,
gonna
I know,
totally regret this.
I know, I
But
know.
well, so I really like what you're pointing out, that there's all of this rich, to kind of paraphrase a little bit. There's all this richness that we get in a remote setting that we actually don't get in real life. And I gotta say, like, speaking as kind of an introvert, like, I love the fact that it's kind of more explicit, and also that we're all figuring it out together rather than
Mhm.
millions and millions of years of evolution programming some people to be like insanely good at understanding body language. And then some people are like not as good. It's like everyone's on a level playing field now.
Yeah.
And that's kind of nice, actually.
Yeah, I was gonna say, yeah, everybody's on a level playing field, and there's less pressure around like dressing like a certain way too. I would say,
I
if
did
I'm
dress up
gonna,
for this. I had
yeah,
the nice like
it
turtleneck.
looks yeah, very Steve Jobs esque. I
Thank you.
like it. I
Yeah.
like it. It's
I have an
very
iPhone
fitting.
to sell you.
Yeah, it's very fitting. But I would never walk into a client meeting in a t-shirt, and I'm in a t-shirt right now, and it looks fine, hopefully, right?
I, I
And
I'm kind of insulted right now. Are you saying that our listeners
I mean,
are
it's
not
it's
our customers? That
no,
we're
it's
not
it's
trying
a
to offer
very
them.
this is a very nice t-shirt though. This is an expensive
Okay.
t-shirt, right?
Oh,
And
you're
so
you're the person that Macklemore talks about in thrift shop, like those $50 t-shirts. He's like, "Don't buy that." Okay, I
yeah,
see.
yeah, something like that, something like that. And yeah, it makes you focus more on the verbal and like the delivery, because like people can focus on this box, right?
Mhm.
And I know that's kind of counter to what I said at the beginning. I said there's a lot of distractions with screens all around you, but there is also this like this sense of being able to focus on what, like you said, like a level playing field, and everybody is, has the same podium,
Mhm. Mhm.
So yeah, I
You
I
you
agree with that.
you don't have the big boss kinda, like, taking up all the space
Yeah.
and those
Yeah,
other, like,
yeah, yeah.
vibes. And it's just something I'm curious about. Like, it seems to me that you sort of have a compressed level of energy, like an energy range that you can get over video. Like in person, you can get really, really low energy to really, really high energy to like super like power posy, powerful space taking up and like kind of sponged up. I'm curious how that dynamic, how you think about that dynamic, both in person and like how that translates into Zoom.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I do agree. That's an interesting thought that there's this compressed energy range. Because you're right, in person, you could use your hand motions more, and that's more apparent. Virtually, like you can still do that, but it's probably doesn't have the same effect. What I find myself doing is to create that range with like topic breadth, if that makes any sense. So I'll give you an example. Oftentimes when you're on a virtual meeting, there's like a talk track that people are trained to give, right? And we talked about this in previous episodes too. You want to be able to stay on
Mm,
topic. You give the pitch, you have like, your agenda, and a lot of people struggle with going outside of. What I like to do
mm,
is I like to have one or two topic areas or one or two instances, or maybe even more if it's a really exciting conversation where we go off path a few
mm,
times, right? And that can be like on the topic of what you're selling, and you just say, "Hey, I know this isn't on the slide, but by the way, like where this is going is X, Y, and Z." Or, "Hey,
mm,
Alex, what you mentioned there is really interesting. I actually wasn't going to talk about this, but now that you mention it, I do actually want to talk about infrastructure as code and like our roadmap there, because that's actually one of our big focus areas." And you'll see this in the product, but I'll just tell you like a few exciting use cases that I've come across in the last few days. Just yesterday, I was talking to a customer. You see what I'm saying? Like all of a sudden, like that is like, you're kind of like creating this range of you're broadening your guardrails or guidelines
mm,
to keep the person engaged. So I think it's a lot
mm,
about, it's a lot about topic variety and topic flexibility.
mm.
And
Mhm.
in
Oh, I
that,
see.
I think you can create a lot of energy, right? And I've seen that
Mm,
happen, and I purposely do that and I
Mm,
train my reps to think about that too. It's not about
mm.
how well you can follow the script, it's about how well you can off-road from the script, right?
So kind of what you're saying, if I'm following along properly, is in a physical environment, you can maybe stay a little bit more on script because you can bring a lot of the change and the energy that comes from change just through the physical presence. Whereas in
Yeah.
a virtual environment, you now have to use this other lever that you have, which is the text, the content, and you make it more interesting and more dynamic. And I've heard you use that phrase off-roading a few times in the podcast now. I really like it. It's so descriptive of what a salesperson needs to be ready to do. And yeah, that really resonates actually.
Yeah, and you know what? Actually, now that I'm like thinking about it a little bit more, in person you can still off-road, but that usually happens when you're setting up your monitor in the room, right? Or when
Mm,
you're in the elevator with your client and you have to make something
mm.
up, right? Because you don't have a presentation to look at. Or like after the presentation's over, you like loosen up a little bit and you're like, okay, so where are we going to dinner? Yeah, you know, and so you kind of there's natural physical space to create that, but you need to create that in a virtual world, and the question is how, right?
Mm,
And so I think that's like where the art of virtual selling is like,
mm,
how can you, when you have a virtual box to sell in, how can you create those elevator moments, right? How can you create those
mm,
lobby moments? How can you create those dinner moments that you
mm,
don't otherwise get? And that's what I mean is like, even when it's about the product, usually like you start
mm.
talking about roadmap and vision over drinks, you get a little bit more comfortable and you're like, and this is where we're really headed, right? And it's like, I didn't tell you this in the board meeting, because like this is like next gen stuff that we're working on, but and like you kind of
Oh,
need
so
to
I see. This
create
is where
that.
you give away all the roadmaps that engineering tells you not to tell people about.
Yeah, like kind of like the under the hood stuff,
Uh-huh.
right? I mean, luckily, like we're all aligned on the engine product side, like
Of
most of the
course.
time.
Of course
But
you are.
yeah, like kind of giving the customer the behind the curtain look. If you
Mhm.
can do that in a pitch
Mm.
and you can create those topics that are like really like energizing, exciting, and a little bit different than the scripted version. Like, I think you really are ahead of the game in a virtual sales arena.
I really like that. This idea of kind of creating I love the lobby moment. Really
Yeah.
great way to put that.
Yeah.
And
And actually, funny enough, Sales Room, our sponsor, they have a virtual lobby, actually.
oh, nice.
Yeah,
Nice.
where
I
you
love
can
it.
like queue up your like own Spotify playlist. But,
That's
like
great.
you
That
can
gives you like some hooks.
yeah, exactly. You can like, and then that gives you a conversation point, like in the meeting, a
Exactly.
a memorable thing, right? And so like,
Mhm.
there are these like, and even without that, you need to be really like naturally good at creating those moments because
Mhm.
those like highlight moments are oftentimes what buyers take away from through your engagements, right? It's not
Mhm.
necessarily like the features exactly. It's like the feeling of what it felt like to be on the call with you and being able to
Mm.
carry on like, topics of conversation that build rapport and relationships, right?
As we're speaking about this, one of the things we've talked about in the past, one of our episodes is on getting dinners with clients. Obviously, you're not going to sit there over Zoom and have like a dinner, everyone sadly eating in front of their monitor with, their business counterpart. It sounds like a real dystopia. Um, but I'm curious, what's replaced that?
Yeah, I think what's replaced that is just being able to reference your personal life, and not
Mm,
being afraid to reference that, right? And so, oftentimes when I take clients to dinner, it's an opportunity to show them my culture. So I think there's an episode about this where I'd rather take
hmm
people to a Korean barbecue restaurant than a steakhouse, right? Because
I
I think it's
remember
more
that.
fun, right? I'd rather go to like K-Town karaoke than, whatever like Irish bar like everybody wants to go to, right? So, um, I think like you still can reference things, in short verse and still build relationships that way. I often find myself, like talking about the meal I had yesterday or talking about my kids. If I notice somebody with the background with like, kid drawings in the back, which has happened before, I'll ask like, "Oh, do you have kids? It looks like you have kids."
Mhm.
There's a lot of pet conversations because a lot of pets come into view. So I think still being able to reference your life and not just like what's working well, but what's also difficult, like I think
Mm,
builds camaraderie. With
mm,
parents, it's really difficult in COVID times to figure out logistics when you have, a classroom with an exposure. All of a sudden
mhm.
you're a week with like a toddler like next to you on all your Zoom calls. And, that instantly bonds people, if you're parents. Um, if you're, from a specific city and I've been to like,
Shared suffering.
yeah, I've been to Des Moines, Iowa. And I remember in Des Moines, Iowa, like I had the best steak of my life. So if somebody's in Iowa, I might talk about that steak,
Mm, mhm.
and like it's still talking about some of the same things, but in like a compressed way where you could still say, "Hey, like, I know you're human and we're still talking about human things?"
Totally. Yeah, I really like that. And it reminds me that this remote world really does bring people's personal lives into the film.
Yeah,
And
it really does. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
so it helps in a way with that, right? All the moments are lobby moments because you're always in somebody's, you know, lobby or their house, their bedroom.
Yeah.
That might be a little weird,
Yeah,
but
sometimes.
sometimes,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, and all these are recorded. A lot of these calls are recorded, actually. Now that's the new norm, right? In virtual
Mhm.
sales. You have companies like Gong and Sales Room and Chorus, all these companies
Mhm.
where you record the call. And so it allows for interesting coaching moments
Mhm.
on, the off-roading
Mm.
topic and around the rapport building. Like you
Yeah.
can even comment on like, hey, Alex, that was actually a really special thing that you did. Like, building that
Mm.
rapport in the beginning of the call. Right. And I like calling those things out because
Mhm.
those are important to be coached too. And sellers need to understand they're empowered to make the space for that
Mhm.
as well. And that you don't just have to be a rule or script follower.
Well, I'd love to dive in a little bit more on that area actually, because I think one of the things you mentioned, this idea that tools like Salesroom or Gong or others can record the conversation and you can learn from it. Seems like such a powerful direction. And I'm curious what you see as the future of these kinds of tools.
Yeah, I think the future of these tools is the first thing I already mentioned, right? Being able to coach on soft skills a lot more
Hmm.
easily and a lot more surgically, I should say, which is like an amazing
Mm,
opportunity. You can actually like retrospectively look at what you're doing to build the
mm,
relationship, which, EQ like analysis hasn't really been done a lot in sales, I would say. You just kind of
mhm,
hear about these people who are amazingly effective at running a presentation or like
mhm,
directing a room, right? So I think there's a lot of coaching opportunities. I also think there's a lot of opportunities to actually make the sales process a lot more efficient
mm,
because through a 1 hour meeting recording, like, and I'm gonna talk about Sales Room again. I think there's other platforms that could potentially do this, but you can now create highlight reels of that meeting and be able to actually take that content, that video content, and send it to
mm,
multiple stakeholders at the company without ever meeting them.
mhm,
Right? I think that's
mhm,
like a really powerful concept because from the thought of taking an hour meeting and creating a 1 minute highlight reel of all the most important elements of that meeting is super efficient, first of all, and then allows you as a seller to resell the meeting, right? Especially because you said in the beginning, it's extremely exhausting. It is exhausting. So why not take an exhausting meeting that you prep hours for and turn it into a highlight reel, right? I think that's like a really interesting thing. I'll tell you a really funny, I think I actually told you this story about me at a karaoke bar and there's a video recording of me singing
mhm. Yep.
Gangnam Style, like, at a karaoke bar, and that video at one of my prospects got circulated to, like, 40 or 50 people at this multi, like, what do you call it? It's like multinational media conglomerate, let's say. I won't mention which one it
You're
was.
lucky
But
you haven't ended up on TV or
yeah,
YouTube.
yeah, I know, right? I mean, it was like very low. This is probably like 2013, very low quality video. But the procurement guy the day after was like, "Hey, your video was a hit at my company." So it's like that's kind of like a funny example. But what if you have like such an amazing meeting, right? Like boiler room style or Glengarry Glen Ross style,
Uh-huh,
right?
uh-huh.
What if you have such an amazing meeting that you just want to like that even the buyer wants to replay it in front of their colleagues? That's really exciting to me. Because there's so many moments in my sales career where I'm like, I remember what I said at that point in time in that room. And like,
Well,
I felt like that was when I won the deal.
and
What if you, yeah, yeah. So,
I just want to point out that the other nice thing about this is you get to choose the highlight reel. I
yeah,
think in
exactly.
this,
Yeah, you get to choose it. Yeah,
you can decide whether you want your karaoke singing to be on there or not. So you get a little bit of personal curation. I think is part of this,
yeah,
which is
and then
kind
you
of
can
nice.
cut out the stuff that's boring, right? Or where you felt
Hmm.
like you were like rambling or whatever it is. So I think it's like an extremely powerful concept. I think that's where these tools are headed is taking live game tape, you know,
Mm.
and
Hmm.
being able
Hmm.
to turn it into something usable when a lot of like call
I
recordings
love
right now
that.
are stuck in archives.
You're going from the high school football on like public access TV to Fox NFL Sunday quality,
Yeah.
and it's huge different. You get the
Yeah, exactly.
instant
Actually,
replay with the telestrator, and maybe not
yes,
John Madden or
yes.
whatever, but maybe you
Yes,
could.
yeah.
You can even voice over the voiceover sometimes.
Totally, and I think that's coming, I think, like, there's gonna be, like, clips where maybe you and I even, like, judge the clip, and we're like, "Oh boy, this salesperson's talking way too much."
Thumbs down.
Or like, "Oh, wow, this guy really hit him with the strip line phrase."
Well, that's actually it. You talk about talking too much, but I do feel like one of the cool things that I've seen from Sales Room, and I think is really probably only possible in a virtual environment, is this idea of like actually measuring airtime, and especially if
Mhm.
you can do something like that in real time, that seems like a really powerful way to course correct. Because if you're talking too much, you probably misalign the energy in that room.
Totally. Yes, yes, I love that feature actually where it, like, periodically pops up, "Hey, you've been speaking 43% of the time." Which is great actually, because 'cause you're speaking less on the other side, right?
Hmm.
Uh, this conversation is probably way too heavily weighted towards me, but it's
Yeah,
a
you always
different
talk too much, Peter, but I think that's the
yeah,
point.
different scenario, but yeah, those cue cards are awesome. Also, like, not only talk time, but detecting when you interrupt people too much,
Mm,
right? In real time, like, that doesn't really happen today.
mhm.
Also detecting, questions that come up and, like, actually showing it in a transcript view. So the person doesn't have to actually put it into the chat, right? So like these things I think are really powerful.
This needs like a name, like a category name, like augmented selling or augmented EQ. I don't know. I'm not a marketer, but it feels like there's something here that like broadly
Uh-huh.
is similar to augmented reality in terms of the ability to see the world through this new lens. Except augmented reality is really weird because you're walking around with like glasses, but here it's actually already on your computer. So like, yeah, you might as well just use it and take like advantage of this heads up display that you have.
Yeah. I also think about like, can I have like a list of questions I want to go through that pops up, right? And every
Hmm.
time I tick through the questions, it automatically crosses it off, right? And can I bank
Well,
that somewhere, right?
yeah.
Automatically without having to physically like put it somewhere, right?
Mhm. It'd be pretty cool if it could detect when you're off-roading. I know that's, like, pretty advanced, but,
Yeah, it'd
the
be awesome.
ability to sort of, like, help you know when you need to, like, take the get back on track could be pretty
Yeah,
neat too.
yeah. Yeah, yeah, and that technology is definitely there, right? And I'd love to like, yeah, see that kind of data. to see like, okay, how many of my reps are offboarding or off-roading, I should say. How
Mhm.
many of my reps are utilizing the dramatic pause? You know, like what's the interaction rate? How are you ping-ponging back and forth? Gong has that, but it's like, can you actually see that in real time?
Yeah, that to me, that feels like the big differentiator is the real time. And the
Yeah.
more you can move into real time, the better.
Yeah. Agree. Completely agree.
Well, Peter, I feel like we've just covered so much in this episode, and I want to pause momentarily and create a little space for you. You've been doing a lot of virtual selling. You think it's here. I know you think it's here to stay, and you've seen a lot of the power. You've seen a lot of the challenges. What is the one feature you really wish you had?
Wow, that is such a great question. The one feature I wish I had, um, ooh, that's a tough one. Let me think about it for like 30 more seconds. There's so many of them, to be honest with you. I'll say as a sales leader, the one feature I wish I had is being able to have a virtual sales room, a virtual platform that automatically helps map out and progress the deal in my CRM
Hmm.
without any manual intervention.
Hmm.
And like for me to get that information through like
Hmm.
timelines or reports, right? Because there's too much right now that relies on sales reps having great CRM
Hmm.
hygiene.
Hmm.
And for me, I know there's a lot of gold happening in virtual rooms that I'm not a part of. So
Hmm.
I guess it's like a feature set. It's like this,
Yeah.
like, it's like this like timeline view of all the deals that close. Like this quarter, let's say like we've closed 100 deals. I'd love 100 timelines, honestly, all analyzed against each other
Hmm.
around like calls and like emails and Slack messages and sentiment analysis, and there's like various tools that have elements of this, but there's not really one that I really like love and lean into.
Hmm.
And
And
why is that like really interesting to me is because also like I'm huge on educating the company on sales. And if I could take a deal, an enterprise deal that took 3 months and condense it into a visual
hmm.
timeline with like these milestone spikes that goes into like the story of the deal, that's powerful, right? And so that's something I'm looking for is because like every deal is a story. And one of our
Hmm.
main investors is Jeffrey Katzenberg, amazing storyteller. And obviously, like if you're behind creating like The Lion King and Aladdin, like you have to be able to capture the audience. And that's I think about that in the sales context is how do you like capture and exceed the expectations of your audience? And your audience is not only your
Hmm.
buyers, but it's also the people that are in your company that want to be educated around sales. It's your team that wants to be inspired by sales, right? And it's, people like our listeners who want to learn about sales. So, yeah.
And I think that first of all, that sounds like a really awesome feature. And I think what you're kind of getting at, just to maybe tie it all together, is this idea that you could probably collect that data in real time with some smart assist features,
Yeah. Yeah, I think so.
right?
You
It
could you
ties
could
into
you could you could collect deal risk from calls,
yeah.
you know? You could
You
collect
probably
like
estimate it based on
Mhm.
airtime and these other features.
Yes.
And if you have that roadmap, like sales, we talked about sales room having the roadmap of questions. You could easily imagine integrating, a point where you then like assess what the next step in the deal is going to be, for example.
Yeah.
From that, it seems super powerful. I'm in.
Extremely. Awesome. I'm glad. Yeah, so am I. I wish I had it, because yeah, you're right. The
We,
data's out there and forecasting, you're forced to put forecasting into 4 or 5 buckets, right? And you're reliant on the reps and managers to be like, this deal has a 10% chance of closing.
hmm.
But there's data out there that can inform that in an automatic fashion while still telling an amazing story about the deal.
Wow. Well, sounds like you got your investment thesis.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Peter, I think maybe we should wrap this one up for our listeners. But
Sounds good.
it in closing, I want to say first of all to our listeners, thank you as always, and especially for journeying with us on our first ever video episode. As always, we would love to hear from you. We are podcasters at decodingsalespodcast.com. And finally, we want to give a final big shout out to our friends at salesroom.com. They are looking for your signups. They are the only platform that has been video conferencing platform that has been built from the ground up to help you break through as a salesperson amid all the noise that is out there. So please go check them out, salesroom.com. And like us, spread the word, help us get the word out too.